Good day, greetings. Thank you for joining the webcast today. Our topic for today is performance benchmarking meets developer experience, a holistic approach to API quality and maturity. And before we dive in, I just want to, go through a couple of housekeeping notes. First, the session is being recorded, so by remaining, you consent to being recorded. The upside, of course, is that we're going to share a recording with attendees via email afterwards, and the presentation will be available on YouTube shortly afterwards. The second point is that we will have a bit of a roundtable discussion at the end of the presentation, and so we welcome your questions as we go along. Feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat box, and for non-urgent questions, we will save those to the conclusion and the roundtable and get to as many of those as we can. So just a bit of background on our topic. We're really saying that, one of the biggest obstacles to the success of an API program is finding a way to model and measure quality and maturity. And this is something that organizations have been trying to do for many years, developed a number of different scores. But to us, it really boils down to the performance and behavior of the APIs, combined, of course, with a quality developer experience. The question is, how do you reliably measure these activities so that you can improve them over time? So we have a perfect panel of speakers here to discuss this holistic approach. First, we're joined by Caroline Lewko, who is the CEO of Revere Communications. And Caroline is a thought leader and a connector in the world of digital experience at Revere. She leads a team across developer relations, developer marketing, developer experience, developer education, and developer access. So very comprehensive scope there. And notably, Caroline is the author of Developer Relations, a book that I just happen to have beside me, and which everybody in tech should really keep on their desk, because it really is fast becoming the industry standard textbook for building successful DevRel programs. We're also joined by Mariana Velasquez, who is a policy author at Platformable, which is a company that shares data on the growth of open ecosystems and tracks how value is being generated and distributed, a large component of this being a measurement of the quality of developer experience. And finally, David O'Neill, he's the founder and CEO of APImetrics. He leads our team that focuses on creating meaningful monitoring and validation for digital businesses, with a heavy emphasis currently on open banking, which we will be discussing today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Caroline Lewko to talk about developer experience and some emerging best practices for how to address it. So over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, David, for giving me the opportunity to join. There's all of our friendly faces this morning. So yeah, please go on to the next slide. I'm going to just talk briefly about what the developer experience is and why it's so important. And again, I'm Caroline Lewko with Revere Communications. And I'm really happy to be able to participate in this because developer experience is a topic that I've been quite vocal about talking about the importance of over the last several years. And we certainly want to see more and more companies understand what it is and be able to do something about it, have a good developer experience. So firstly, I like to ask this question. How many of you watching this webinar actually have a developer product in your portfolio? And most of you probably have an API, but there's a number of other different developer products as well, SDKs, HDKs, different platforms and tools. And what's important about that is when you have your API, it's important that you think about it as a product and you create the necessary resources around it as a product in order for it to be successful. Let's go on to the next slide. The next slide, please. in order to be really successful then with your product, one more back.
Sorry.
No problem. The question I ask then too is, do you actually have a developer relations, or better known as a DevRel program? So those include a lot of the resources that you need to have, again, to have this product successful. So as Andrew mentioned earlier, there's developer marketing, education, success, a community around it, and what we're talking about today is developer experience. And I wanted to touch on just this definition of developer experience. It's becoming something that's more well known, and there's actually really two ways of looking at developer experience. There's internal developer experience, we call it DX, which some of you might be hearing about. And that's really about how do you treat and how do you support developers as an employee? And certainly if you've got an API, you might have external developers using it, but a lot of times you've got your internal developers using that API and building something with it as well for your own internal purposes. For external DX or developer relations, that's the developer as a customer or a user. And again, either way, whether your product and your API is being used internally or externally, or probably both, you're going to want to make sure that the developers can build the best experience, can build the best product they can. A couple of, next slide, please. Here's a couple of reasons why. So if we go on to this slide here, it's also known as the developer-driven software market. And what you'll see here, and this is, now kind of a year or so old, something that Tyler Jewell from Dell, he's tracked a ton of companies who do have products for developers, and he tracks it as a really large market, $50 billion market. What we're seeing from other studies too is it's moving towards $1 trillion market. That means it's really significant. That also means that there's a lot of other people that are offering products for developers. So if you want yours to be successful, you need to do a good job of that. If we take a look at the next slide, it shows another reason. So 66% of developers have at least some influence over their organization's purchases of new technologies. This is really key. Now, if you come from a bank perhaps, or a more traditional technology organization, you're probably used to your persona being, the customer is a company, and you don't really think about who the user is. And it might be somebody in purchasing, or some other VP that you think is making a decision. Things have really changed over the last number of years, where again, now developers are actually having influence. So knowing what that decision-making unit is for your tool and how developers have influence over that is very much important, again, to how you roll out your product and how you support it. So what we've done, we can go on to the next slide now. As part of what, actually, I'll just back up for a minute here. This kind of encapsulates too a number of reasons to think about developers. So often we hear, is development easier or harder today? Often we'll hear, well, it's going to be easier today because there's all these APIs that abstract a lot of that hard work and heavy lifting for developers. There's a lot of low-code tools. But I really believe that development is harder today because there's just more. There's more programming languages, there's more tools, there's more competition, there's more skill set that developers need to know about. So again, if you think about developers are a key decision maker in buying and using your tools, and development is harder, how do you make their life easier? So on to the next slide. Over the course of 15 or more years that I've been working in this space, we put together what we call our developer journey map. So what exactly does a developer do when they're deciding to investigate a new tool, evaluate a new tool, and eventually build with it and scale with it? And it's really incumbent on you, if you've got an API, to think about this. Where does a developer land? What are you telling them they do? And if you look in the middle where you see the developer experience, which talks about product and also all the documentation that goes around that product. These are things that need to be optimized for the developer journey. Developers early on too, the way they make decisions and the way they adopt is very different from a typical B2B scenario. First, they're going to take a look at what you've got and what the resources are. Then they're going to want to try something in something we call a hello world before they actually start to build. So you really need to have these things in place. And just to finalize the sort of the wrap up on what I'm going to talk about, I'll show you the next slide. And we often do developer journey maps and developer what we call friction logs for many of our customers. And I'm not going to name any names, but this has come from one of them, where you can see, you know, the developer comes in and, you know, the SEO that you had wasn't bad and they've landed where you want them to go. But look at how far they had to go to actually find out what they were doing. You know, they went over to the corporate page and then they're over to sign up. That didn't work very well. You know, they're coming back to use cases, they're going to a getting started guide, the FAQs, because they're red, are probably non-existent or aren't there. Developers want to know who else is using it, or their forums, or there's something that they can look at and get some answers to. The good news, the support was good on this one. But if you can see, you know, it should be something that's fairly easy for the developer to go across and start to build. And this particular one, just to get to, you know, somewhere along that build stage was 111 steps. We call that a DX fail. So we really would like you to, you know, take a look at this, see what you can offer, and then I'm sure Mariana as well will give you some extra tips in how to optimize some of these different landing points or touch points along the way. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. And well, very interesting. And before I touch the topic of developer experience, I would like to give some context of how big these open banking initiatives in the world are growing, right? And if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as a policy analyst at Platformable, I have been studying the implementations and the approaches of open banking in the world, and I wanted to share with you this map because it is very clear how it is getting colored. I mean, 5 years ago, we could only see a few countries spotted in colors, and now we can see how these initiatives of open banking, of open finance have been increasing and being adopted by more and more countries. I mean, even evolving from covering the financial sector only to covering other relevant sectors in the economy, as it would be the case in Australia, for example, with the introduction of the consumer data right, that they started with banking and now they're moving to telcos and energy sectors. So what we have learned is that, of course, there are different views and approaches of governments. There are governments that mandate certain institutions to share data of their customers with third parties, with the prior consent of the customers, which in the end are the owners of the data. Then we have a more market-driven approach where financial institutions and fintechs share data to offer solutions to their customers, and the relationship is governed by bilateral agreements. And there is another hybrid approach, or a facilitative approach, where authorities are lighter and they issue some guidelines and some requirements, but data sharing practice is adopted voluntarily by firms. So if we can change to the other slide, please. So to keep, I think I was missing one. Andrew, I don't know, the last one that I sent you. Oh, don't worry. I have the information here.
My apologies. It should be in here.
Yeah, no worry. It's okay. I have the information. Also, for the purpose of context, I wanted to share some trending facts and numbers from our latest quarterly report. We identified that the global financial service infrastructure reached over 1,500 open banking platforms, creating over 5,000 API products and over 3,600 API-enabled fintech apps at the end of Q3 2022. We also identified that regulations keep emerging in some regions and standards help accelerate fintech participation within a market where consumers are demanding the digital solutions. We also noticed that in the UK and Europe, platform growth is slowing considerably due to a largely unchanging regulatory landscape, which probably we are going to see some changes next year because both the UK and Europe are reviewing their mandates, and they're planning to expand the scope of their mandates to become an open finance approach. Also, bank business models continue to favor partnerships with fintechs, where banks own the relationship with the clients. So those were some of the trends that we have identified. And having said this context, we can see now that it's a fact that firms managers need to cope with a whole new stack of processes and activities, and they need to get information, good indicators to understand how they are doing with their data sharing strategies and what's the direction. So basically, at Platformable, we conducted a series of interviews with top executives from different banks to learn what were the indicators they would need to get in order to understand the direction of their open banking strategy. And what we learned from that exercise was that managers need to get information from three different perspectives, which are from a business perspective, a technical perspective, and support perspective. So in general, what business operations and technology managers want to know and are interested in seeing in those indicator reports are, among other things, what is obviously their API performance, what are the variations that are occurring from one month to another, and try to identify opportunity areas for enhancement. They want to understand what is their performance as compared to their competitors. So they need to get benchmark reports to see where they are standing in the market. On the technical side, for example, they want to know what if there are any degradation patterns that require attention, and most importantly, actions. They want to know relevant news and highlights in order to keep track of the ecosystem's evolution. Of course, they want to know reports that provide indications on monetization. And of course, they need to have indicators on the level of engagement with developers. And it is precisely this last point that I want to talk about, developers. So can we change, please, the next slide? Thank you. So the Platformable team, after making a large research and analysis of hundreds of developer portals around the world, it was built a scoring indicator that measures the ease with which developers could create valuable products on open banking platforms. So the elements are categorized in three resources groupings, which are the onboarding support resources, and we refer to if they have a developer portal, if they have a sandbox environment. We have then the next category is retention support resources, which refer to use case descriptions and getting started guides, for example. And finally, we have the commercial support resources, and we identify if they have clear pricing pages and API marketplaces to promote products built with a providers' APIs. So in our methodology, we have identified 15 developer resources, so which are in this list that you can have in the presentation when it's distributed. So what we do, we search for all these elements on the list, we add up the ones we identified, and then we get the score out of a total of 15, all right? So here to the right, we can see a benchmark analysis of the developer experience indications in a particular country. So in the last quarter, we reported some of the top scoring platforms that include API catalogs, guidelines, partner onboarding steps, and use case descriptions, forthcoming APIs, which act as a roadmap to assist third-party providers to start thinking about designing new fintech products and services. So just to give you an idea, in the past quarter, we estimated a 41% average developer experience score globally, right? So what does that mean? That means that there is a huge room for improvement. I think that everybody is learning. We're still around the world, everybody's still learning. They are doing, making these changes and adapting to this new reality. But there's big room for improvement. So next one, please, Andrew. So thank you. So to close this intervention, I just wanted to reiterate that we firmly believe that developer resources are key for the creation of value, and we encourage firms to do quality checks to the developer portals, not to abandon their developer portals, as those elements are important for companies to thrive in this present and the future of financial services. Thank you.
And over to David.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Two tough acts to follow. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the industry benchmarks we followed at APImetrics. And if we move to the next slide, just a little background on who we are. We were founded in 2015 and started life monitoring APIs for developers. And we've built out a very data-driven system for looking at the end-to-end performance of APIs. And one of the things that we found was companies and developers and organizations in general tended to try and avoid talking about the end-to-end story. We actually were on a conversation yesterday with a senior site reliability engineering lead, where, as far as he was concerned, the only metrics that mattered were internal metrics. It was almost as if he was trying to pretend that there weren't end users and customers. And it's the really the intersection of developer operations, developer security, and regulatory frameworks is where APImetrics really comes into its own, and where we're focusing our effort. And what we're trying to do is come up with ways that people can all use to agree on essentially what is good and what is not, and bridge that gap between the customer experience for an API and what the safety of your gateway logs or your APM stack are telling you. Because what we see time and time again is there can be quite big discrepancies, and more often than not, that the customer is often right that they're seeing something that you're not seeing in your own logs. So if you want to move on, Andrew, I'll talk about some data from a real life open banking client. So this is from the end of September, and historically they've been a pretty stable provider, but we use our own quality scoring methodology that allows us to essentially rank them out of 10. It's a bit like a net promoter score. And the idea is we want to be able to have something that is understandable to the business as well as to the operation side of things. And to echo from something that Caroline was talking about, there is a bit of a them and us attitude we perceive in a lot of organizations between the developer teams and the solutions that are being delivered. And we're trying to give everybody metrics that they understand and can rely on, so that they understand the quality of what they're providing or what they're consuming. They understand what the governance implications of their life cycle are. There's a tendency we're observing in clients to do a lot of work on the design side, but then not actually have the controls and mechanisms in place to validate that design work actually is what is being implemented. And that crosses over into the two areas of performance and security. And what we're seeing with customers is they can quickly go from being a top performer to a poor performer with outages appearing and then disappearing and not really being tracked or understood if those outages are dependent on systems outside of their direct control. So what we're pulling up is where the performance is best, where the performance is worse, which cloud data centers, which geolocations are causing those issues, and therefore people can work out which of their customers will actually be concerned about their overall operations, even if there's nothing internally showing a problem. Can you just move on, please, Andrew? So with this provider, they had over 8 hours of outage, and depending on how you look to their numbers, their averages were actually pretty good, and they had reasonably high availability. It was up in the 94% or so. But what was putting them down was the number of passing slow or calls that just fell outside of what was their normal expected performance parameters. And that's the kind of thing that gets left out of a lot of the thinking around traditional ops monitoring and ops tooling. And if you don't see it from inside your stack, you're just not going to, you're not going to expect it to be there. Can you move on? And what we see over and over again is you will see clusters of poor performing calls that take a very long time. The scale on the side is tens of thousands of milliseconds. So this scale shows calls that took anything from 30 seconds from, I can't see what the median on that one is, but it's probably half a second, up to 2 minutes. And they clearly had some performance issues. We were able to see that it's affected all clouds, but it's something that is affecting different data centers in different ways, and therefore different users will experience different problems with the clouds. And what we're trying to do is give people a methodology and an understanding into, it's not just about what you designed in, it's not just about what you can measure directly and feel comfortable with. Our advice on benchmarking is you have to get outside of your comfort zone, and you have to start understanding not just what you are providing, but as to follow on from Mariana's points, it's how do all of the systems that you have interplay and interlock, and what is that, as Andrew's put it at the start of this, the holistic view of quality, governance, and operations that apply across all of your APIs. And that's in a nutshell what we're starting to realize companies, the business of APIs is starting to worry about, and that's product managers, customer success teams, CIO office, CTO office in large organizations where the business of running your business is about your APIs and the quality of your API stack, which is slightly different to how we've approached some of these IT things. And I think what this speaks to is the maturity of the industry, and the industry is somewhat growing up. And it's less about, we need an API program, we need to get it out to developers, but what are the implications of having that program, and how do we actually verify in a way that everybody agrees to? And that's where we see the benchmarking and the ability to audit what you've done and do it in a consistent and provable way to close the loop on your DevRel activities, the quality of the service that you're delivering from can developers use it, how does it work, the work that Platformable has been doing in the regulated space, through to how do we prove not just to regulators but to the third parties we work with, we're delivering a good quality of service, and what do we mean by good, and how do we actually tick the boxes that things like the security operations are working the way we expect, that the design that we designed is still what we are delivering. And that's what we're seeing, is there are still quite big gaps between providers at different levels. And just a final data point on this, we recently produced a report with the news media site Finextra and found that there's a massive difference between the neobanks, the new entrants into financial services, and the quality of service they can deliver on a consistent basis, and the traditional banks, the smaller building societies in the UK or credit unions in the US. They are suffering from both a technical debt and a skills deficit in terms of what they can deliver. But if they're not to meet the fates of some other industries, there's really something there that then they need to understand and pull up. I think we'll probably talk about that after the presentation piece. But the key thing, just to summarize, performance matters. The quality of service that you deliver is just as important as can people use your services? Are you providing a service that meets the regulatory requirements of your industry? And do people experience your APIs consistently well from any cloud data center they might connect to it from? And can you prove that to a third party? And I think what we're pulling together is these are all essential parts of that developer journey and developer story. But I'd take it one step further and say it's a business story now. And it's not just about APIs have grown up out of being the way that a way that can make more interesting solutions possible into it's the way we deliver business. And in the same way, you wouldn't buy anything for your organization without doing some due diligence for understanding what it is you're buying or supplying. You can't just assume with APIs that that's a done deal. Somebody in DevOps has a graph that they can show and everybody's happy. It's beyond that now. It's like relying on your car's software to state that it's meeting emission standards and then having a very bad day at a testing center. What we'd like people to understand is you have a responsibility to keep on top of these things yourself, but also to do due diligence on the solutions that you're integrating to and consuming from. That's my point, my update.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Mariana. We've covered a lot of territory here in just 30 minutes. And we have a few questions coming in, which I think will serve us well for a roundtable discussion. The first is curious as to which dev resources are most neglected in the open banking companies. And I think a follow-on question to that is, what are the implications of these layers of policy and regulatory compliance on DX? Do they have a specific effect on how you build out a developer program?
Well, I can answer that. Just a few days ago when we were preparing for this event, David was pointing out that they've realized that there are some resources in the developer portals, but however, there are some of them that are not actually working right. So that is very crucial, because what's the point of having resources if they are not going to work, right? So, for example, one of the resources he mentioned was the sandbox. In some cases, sandbox are not working. So, I mean, that's why I think we encourage firms to check what you have, do quality checks, try your sandbox, use your developer portal as if you were a developer that wanted to use your developer portal, right? So, I mean, at Platformable right now, we're not doing the quality check of developer portals. We're just counting the elements that are available for developers. But it's very interesting, this point that, yeah, you know what, you just don't have, you can't just have resources. You need to make sure that they work well. Now, from a regulatory perspective, some regulations, for example, in Mexico and some others, they require the companies to have certain minimum requirements in the developer portals, as it would be the sandbox, as it would be a contact person or a contact area, to solve problems, for disputes. So there are some, in some countries, it has been requested by authorities to have minimum requirements in the communication with the community, right? So yeah, basically that is the indication. What will happen with regulators, that there are rules for certain developer portals? What will happen if they realize that they don't work? And certainly they will have an observation, right? So it is really important to make sure that what you are putting available to the community, that it really works.
Yeah. And just a quick follow-up to that. In terms of the policy and the regulatory environment, does that create an additional overhead for kind of onboarding new developers through the journey?
I don't think it should create an additional overhead. I mean, that's something that that firms would need to have with or without regulation, right?
Mhm.
I mean, firms in market-driven ecosystems, they need to have that, and because that's a way that the developers will come to them, will approach them, and will want to use their APIs. I mean, having a good, offering a good developer experience, mandated or not, has to attract developers,
Mhm.
and that is a way that innovation will thrive.
Great.
I come back
Yeah.
to what I just mentioned in the beginning was your API is a product. So treat it
Mhm.
like a product. And so, yes, it's going to need to have some support around it. Who would have thought? It's going to need a place where developers can do that test, a sandbox. That's really important. And the other piece I wanted to mention as part of that is, as once just because a developer has built with something, has built something with your API, you can't then step away, because there's going to be some upgrades to that. Have you let them know? Have you showed them how that works? Is there a place to test? And there's going to be a lot of other dependencies that they're working with, which, whatever app or platform they're developing. So it's so much more than just, throwing an API out there and expecting it to perform. There's just so many other dependencies and life cycle changes that need to be checked, monitored, made aware of.
And just to build on from that, I think one of the problems, if we take UK open banking, was the evolution of UK open banking started from a regulator specifying a sandbox before they'd actually defined what open banking was. So the banks rushed out to my sandboxes to deliver open banking, but that had ended up having no bearing on the delivery of the service. And one of the comments that we've heard from developers and frustration from third parties integrated to the banks is that they built in good faith two sandbox implementations that turned out to be very, very different to the production environment. I think that's very much a duty of care that people should have with their API products, as Caroline said, to provide consistency and maintain that the services work. Something I know we've all discussed before, but you need to validate that what you are documenting and what you have built is what you are supplying, and that's something I think a lot of people tend to forget. And it comes down to
That's a good idea, David.
it is a good idea, and it's part of what I think Andrew and I are calling runtime governance versus there is a lot of emphasis at the moment on your life cycle governance, the design in security, test for security, test for performance. But a lot of that's done theoretically in the design and test phase. And there's a bit of runtime, that's DevOps, we'll leave that to them. And we'll pretend, and we end up with these two silos of the security, or these silos where the security team does one thing, the design team and the DevRel team do another, and ops do their own thing. And actually, we cannot afford as an industry, and businesses are realizing they can't afford to look at it that way, that actually these are products, your business is either dependent on the consumption of them or your customers dependent on your delivery of them. And you can't just assume somebody else in the organization is taking the 10,000 meter view of the problem, that it is actually something that everybody is on top of. And my belief is we're going to see a lot more concern, particularly in tightening financial times as we may be coming into, of hang on, we need to be assured that what we are paying to deliver and what we are paying to consume are delivering what we expected. And if they're not, we need to have an business escalation system that we can actually rely on. And if we look at the governed sectors, financial services, healthcare, insurance, that are becoming prevalent around the world, they're going to need something to protect themselves from either valid regulatory oversight, where you have done something wrong, you can be fined, or just spurious partners complaining to regulators, potentially just to hide something that they've done. And we've seen both of those scenarios happen in the UK, where regulators have got involved in disputes between parties where both parties can come to the table with proof the other one is lying. And that's not a situation that's sustainable. And as we're seeing from some quite large IT organizations, they are realizing that they can't just mark their own homework. They need to have a way of agreeing between them and their customers that if we say something takes 1.2 seconds, it does actually take 1.2 seconds and not 1.8 or 5 seconds. It's just having trust between the parties that the data actually is true. And if you rely on what your gateway tells you or what your internal logs tell you, you can end up with a very, very rosy view of the universe that doesn't actually match reality. And I think what we're moving into a phase of maturity in the sector where people actually, they don't necessarily care if something is good or bad. They'd like it to be good, but they need to know that the numbers that everybody's talking about can be trusted.
Yeah, that's a great point. And here is a good follow-on question to your point about siloed organizations and this kind of fragmentation. As APIs move from being just technical endpoints to being managed as API products, who owns them? Where does the budget generally come from? And how do you deal with priorities in larger organizations?
Well, that's a good question. I think large organizations, my view is large organizations are currently still trying to figure that one out themselves.
Yeah.
But I think what we're starting to see is a almost seismic shift in a lot of API decision making away from developer teams into line of business and product teams, where the product teams have ownership of the API stack and everything related to it. And they're just starting to realize as they peel these onion layers away that actually it's not just about we've bought an API from provider X or we're supplying an API, but what cloud is it running on? What is it underpinned by? Are we using a CDN service? Is that CDN service reliable? Who do we get who are we using for identity management? Who are we using for security? Does the security monitoring do what we think it does? Or have we just bought something because it looks shiny and they had a really good write-up on a tech news blog? There's a lot of questions. I think we're moving into an era again of maturity. This sector didn't really exist 10, 15 years ago. 10 years ago, it was in its infancy. We were still dealing with, less than 10 years ago, we were still dealing with Twitter continuously destroying business models for people, where they'd open up an API and then get rid of it within a year. We are moving beyond that. People now accept they have to stand behind their APIs and they have to have those solutions. But I think what we're going to see is product management and product owners will own technology stacks, and then they will work with different silos within their organization to provide quality on that. And I think that
we're seeing that too, David, is in where companies big and small are changing the way organizations are organized and function, and we're seeing product teams really being elevated to a VP product, where whatever falls under that again it's treated like a product, and all the pieces around what needs to make that successful are really, really important. Where product before might have been, it's just the group over there that's developing stuff, where it's definitely being elevated in all sorts of companies we're seeing now. It's a good thing.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think particularly what we're seeing in banking and banking technologies is the product owners are the ones actually taking, they are becoming more and more important to these solutions. And it's less just I want something, I'll build it, I'll throw out an API, to we need to have a strategy across the entire organization. It needs to be designed for PSD2 in Europe or what have you, or open banking in the UK, and we need to take these factors into account, and we can't just build something, throw it out there and get on with it.
Yeah, and the key is too, it's just not elevating product for the sake of elevating product. Product then becomes a strategic function of the organization that then needs to think strategically, needs to think across the company, needs to think about go-to-market, needs to think about support, it needs to think about all of those things.
And needs to think about the tooling and the platforms that they use for actually managing that, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Good segue. Are you seeing a convergence of kind of tool chains and ecosystems in terms of registries, gateways, life cycle tooling? Are you seeing convergence, or are you seeing increased fragmentation across the industry?
Are we allowed to say both?
Mhm.
I think people are being more thoughtful, and there are more tooling systems that are being built, and things like APImetrics, which is there to be able to provide a lot of that monitoring. But there's also new companies coming on that are creating, more fragmentation. So we're still in a bit of a messy space right now, is what I'm seeing. Curious, Mariana or David, what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think that you're right. This is, although, for example, in the UK, open banking was born in 2016. We're talking about 6 years ago. It's very nascent. It's early. It's still early for an initiative this big. It's still early. So firms, everybody's still learning and trying to find a way how to get involved and properly in these new ecosystems, right? So yes, I think there's still a lot of fragmentation. There are new services that are emerging. There are platforms that are there to be the central point of consuming and distributing APIs, and regulations are also different. There are not even like global standard definitions of some terms, so I think that, yes, as Carolyn said, I think it might be a little bit messy right now. There's a lot of fragmentation. Developer experiences, as we said earlier, are very different. Developer portals are not, some are, have a high score, others not that much. But I think that the global market is maturing. Differently in each region. But I think this is part of maturing, of growing. Yeah, fragmentation.
Well, the regulatory bodies are catching up with that too. So really, companies don't have much of a choice. It needs to be properly monitored and built.
Exactly.
No,
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Well, I was going to say we do see the same. That I think there was a feeling in 2021 that perhaps we were going to see some more consolidation in the gateway and infrastructure server technology space, and actually it is continued to. There are more gateways emerging. There are new entrants all the time, and we haven't seen that degree of consolidation. We do see a lot of churn. That companies move their tech stack more than you would perhaps think they would. Particularly in the gateway space, there's a lot of I think that's more fungible than people expected it to be. But I think there's still, that's because they're not sure, they're not getting quite what the gateways sold them on. In terms of, I think the gateways were sold as this one ring to rule them piece of magic that would solve all of these governance problems, and actually, because of where the gateway is, it's uniquely placed to not be able to do that for anybody. And anyone who's gone down the route of thinking, yes, picking someone at random, Apigee can solve all my problems, or MuleSoft can solve all my problems, have found out the hard way that actually, no, it doesn't give them what they needed to answer some of these regulatory questions, or answer customer questions, or even plug the gaps in their own coverage of, well, hang on, can we prove that we are a secure solution that's effective? So yeah, I think there's as Mariana says, we're still actually it's a relatively new industry, and it's still finding its feet.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and this one is about developer experience scores. Wonder if you can talk a bit about your experience and what some of the best practices and worst practices are for calculating DX scores and using them to optimize your developer programs?
Me?
Yeah, sure.
Well, yeah, as I said, I mean, basically at Platformable, we do a research of many aspects in this open banking, open finance world, and particularly in developer experience, we just track what are the resources that are made available, right? But we are not measuring the quality yet. Hopefully we can do that in the future. So, but as I said, and I insist, what is the point of exposing features, resources in your portals if they are not going to be functioning or working well, right? I think, for example, what regulators are interested in and requiring the institutions that you need to put a channel for developers to consume your APIs. You need to use clear language for easy to understand. You need to have a team that can solve issues. And if there's any disruption or anything that can be solved, you need to have a sandbox environment, right? Like I said, minimum requirements that firms need to comply with, but that's not enough. I mean, that's a minimum requirement. That's not enough. If you really want to thrive, if you really want to engage with developers, you really need to put out there, like, for example, description of use cases. I've seen portals of banks that are very detailed, and they show customer success stories. They show description of use cases. This can be used like that. Even forthcoming APIs. Look, we're in a beta stage for this API, and this can be used for X and Y and Z use cases. So for developers to start saying, oh, okay, this can work for this, and I don't know, it's I think that companies need to give all the easy tools that can help developers to create value.
Well, companies need to realize that the B2B approach doesn't work, or even within banking, they're used to a B2C, business to consumer approach, doesn't work for the B2D or the business to developer approach. It's different. It needs a different approach. There's different ways of doing it. It's not hard. It's just different.
That's a great point. And I like that B2D.
Well, and I think the bit that's certainly harder for the financial services sector, and is some of the B2D approach that they have. Those developers are actually other banks and other large institutions working under the same regulatory framework. And I think that's something that people have. It sounds like a subtle nuance, but actually you're suddenly dealing with quite large organizations who also are not sure. They're finding their way as well. So I think there's a bunch of complexity there that has been forgotten about. That it's just, well, hang on, we're a big company as well, and I thought we were doing the same things, but why is your stuff wildly different to what we do? And I think that's, that comes back to, we need tools and we need tools and systems that allow us to understand whether we're talking, even if we're talking about apples and oranges or apples and bananas, understanding what the commonalities between those different fruits is and what they look like.
Okay, great. With that, we're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, David. This has been a great discussion, and we will share a link to the recording afterwards, and it'll be available on YouTube for sharing as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Thank you.